Main focus of the task is as follows. First, before pressurizing nitrogen, pressure test, you should open all valves. Second, components such as safety valves and relief valves should be shut off during the pressure test. Third, nitrogen pressure test must be conducted according to the proposed pressure. Fourth, before conducting vacuum work, vacuum test, all sorts of service valve and solenoid valve should be opened for an evacuated state. Fifth, the evacuation pressure, evacuation point, should be below 1000 microns within the given time for the task. Sixth, if the vacuum pressure does not be below 1000 microns, you should keep conducting the evacuation task until it reaches the desired state. Seventh, the vacuum gauge should be installed as far away from the vacuum pump as possible. Please check the preparations and tools for this training. These are precautions. First, you should wear the required safety gears for the nitrogen pressure test and the vacuum test. Second, you should make sure of their safety because the nitrogen pressure test uses high pressure. Third, during the pressure test, you should not exceed the maximum pressure stated on the label of equipment. Fourth, you must conduct the leakage test before and after the pressure test. Fifth, when discharging the nitrogen gas, the gas must be discharged slowly and safely in extremely small amounts. Sixth, for the evacuation work, you cannot use the high vacuum hose that is installed to the vacuum pump. Instead of it, you should use the manifold gauge hose. Seventh, when finished using the vacuum pump, always be sure to close the cap of the connecting valve. Eighth, to maintain the efficiency of the vacuum pump and prolong its life, you should follow directions and management instructions suggested by the manufacturer. Please check what you are going to perform on this task. Examine the pressure of refrigerant piping with nitrogen pressurization. Connect the yellow surface hose of the manifold gauge to the nitrogen gas cylinder. Before the nitrogen pressurization, open all valves in the refrigeration unit so that there are no obstruction. Open all the solenoid valves that only open through electricity by using the solenoid valve opening magnet. You cannot use the general magnet at this time. The blue hose of the manifold gauge should be connected to the low pressure port, and the red hose should be connected to the high pressure port. What is manifold gauge? The manifold gauge consists of two gauges, 2 passive valves, and 3 separated connecting hoses. It is used in many different tasks for a refrigeration system, including evacuation test, refrigerant charge, refrigerant recovery, all sorts of pressure tests, as well as a nitrogen pressure test. When using a manifold gauge, there should be no filth around the hoses and the connecting parts. There should be no moisture and air inside the hoses as well. Control the pressure of the nitrogen gauge. The nitrogen gas cylinder is high-pressured, so you must control the pressure through the gauge, which is equipped with a decompression device. Before the pressure test, check if there is any signs of leakage on the connecting parts of the manifold gauge and nitrogen gauge, and any other area that is prone to leakage with a soapy water. When conducting a leakage test, you should place a dry cloth underneath to prevent soapy water from dripping onto the floor. Open high and low pressure valves so that the nitrogen gas can be pressurized into the refrigeration unit. When opening and closing the valves of the manifold gauge, turn them slowly to make sure strong pressure is not applied abruptly on the gauge. The nitrogen pressure should be based on the low pressure gauge of the manifold gauge. The nitrogen must be pressurized up to the suggested standard in the competition. When pressurizing the nitrogen gas, the pressurization should be conducted slowly for safety. What is a nitrogen pressure test? The nitrogen pressure test refers to a test to check if there's any leakage while the pressure vessels such as compressor and a condenser is connected to the valve after pipe work is finished. After pressurizing the nitrogen gas up to the standardized point, you should inspect every connecting parts with soap water. There also should be no drop in pressure on the pressure gauge for a certain period of time. Nitrogen gas is used for a pressure test. The reason for using the nitrogen gas is because nitrogen gas is a chemically stable gas and has no danger of explosion even when it is mixed with other substances, and it can be pressurized at high pressure and the pressure is less likely to change due to the ambient temperature. The reason for not using the air is because the air contains some moisture itself. If air gets pressured, the moisture in the air starts to condense, which can cause a failure during operation. When the nitrogen pressure inside the device reaches the standard point, close the valves of the nitrogen cylinder and the manifold gauge. While keeping the pressure for the leakage test, check for leakage in all possible areas such as the brazed parts and nut-fitting parts with soapy water. There should be no leakage in all of the inspected area. After the nitrogen pressure test is finished, leave the refrigeration unit for a certain amount of time and check if there is any pressure drops. You can move on to the next step after no leakage is verified. After leaving the refrigeration unit for a certain period of time, discharge the nitrogen gas in the equipment towards the service hose by opening the high and low pressure valves of the manifold gauge. When discharging the nitrogen gas, you should not discharge it into the air, especially to the upper side of the liquid receiver. Just as pressurizing, the gas must be discharged slowly in extremely small amounts to prevent safety accidents. Check whether the nitrogen is completely discharged through the scales on the manifold gauge. Check if all needles of the gauge indicate 0. Disconnect the nitrogen cylinder from the system and seal all connecting parts that are open to the outside, such as valves and pipe ends, with service caps. After completing the pressure test, have the completion verified. This is an evacuation test using a vacuum pump. Check the required tools for the evacuation test. The required tools are a vacuum pump, a vacuum gauge, a manifold gauge, and etc. For the evacuation test, open all valves of the equipment. What is an evacuation test? The evacuation test is to remove the non-condensing gas or moisture remaining inside the refrigerator and inspect the device for leakage before charging the refrigerant after the leakage test. Connect the vacuum gauge to the vacuum pump and turn the power on the vacuum pump, then check whether the value of the vacuum gauge decreases below 1000 microns. The vacuum pump serves to remove any remaining moisture, air, and non-condensable gas inside the refrigeration system. When using a vacuum pump, you should place it on an even surface. Before using the pump, check whether the oil is at the normal oil level through the gradation of oil level gauge. The ability of the vacuum pump is judged by its discharging capacity. The bigger capacity the vacuum pump has, more time can be saved for the evacuation task. It is important to choose the appropriate vacuum pump with the corresponding capacity depending on the task. If you use a vacuum pump with small capacity compared to the task, the spent time gets longer and the lifespan of vacuum pump can be shortened. What is vacuum gauge? It indicates the evacuation level of the system being evacuated. For now, check whether the vacuum gauge indicates the desired vacuum level based on the standard point designated in the task. After the gauge efficiency test, connect the vacuum gauge to the refrigeration unit. The vacuum gauge should be installed as far away from the vacuum pump as possible. However, where the vacuum gauge should be installed might vary depending on tasks of competition. During evacuating, you cannot use the high vacuum hose that is installed to the vacuum pump. Instead, connect the service hose of the manifold gauge to the suction part of the vacuum pump. Open low and high pressure valves of the manifold gauge. Open all sorts of valves inside the refrigeration system. Turn on the vacuum pump to run it, and open the high and low pressure valves of the manifold gauge. Start the evacuation process and aim to be below 1000 microns before the time given for the task is over. If the evacuation level does not be below 1000 microns, you should keep going until it reaches the desired state. Evacuating the system is necessary for charging refrigerant and normal operation of the refrigeration system. If the evacuation reaches the desired state, close the high and low pressure valve of the manifold gauge. Stop the vacuum pump and remove the manifold gauge hose from the vacuum pump. If the vacuum gauge and the vacuum pump are too close, the evacuation state inside the refrigeration system cannot be accurately measured due to the influence of the vacuum pump nearby. Leave the refrigeration unit in the evacuation state for a certain amount of time, which is suggested in the competition. You can start the evacuation test whenever they want, based on what is favorable to them. If you fail to leave the refrigeration unit in the evacuated state, they can pressurize the nitrogen gas again to find a leaking part. Precautions for evacuation are as follows. Make the length of the hose you're using to be as short as possible. If the hose is old or if there's any leakage in the connected part, the evacuation process will not go well or take too much time. If the rubber packing inside the joint of the manifold gauge hose has worn out, the evacuation process will not go well because of leakage. Be sure to exchange the rubber packing with a new one. In particular, if steam is coming out from the vacuum pump outlet, there is a big chance of air coming in from the connecting parts. You should take measures to solve this. If the evacuation level does not change even when you have run the vacuum pump for more than 30 minutes, you should check the ability of the vacuum pump or any leakage in the system. In normal working conditions, 30 minutes of evacuation should give you a certain evacuation level. If the evacuation level does not change even after leaving the refrigeration unit for a certain amount of time, charge refrigerant to more than atmospheric pressure to prevent non-condensable gas from being mixed. When charging refrigerant, the pressure shown on gauge should be as low as around 0.5 kilograms per centimeter squared. The charged refrigerant should be recorded and then totaled up afterwards. Check again the key points of the task we've worked on in this training. In this training, we have learned the nitrogen pressurization and vacuum work. Everybody, thank you for your hard work.